Cool. Hey y'all, my name's Karen. My pronouns are she, they, and I am with Semias AZ.
Hi, my name is Jess. I use they, them pronouns, and I am with Chispa, Arizona.
My name is Raquel. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm with BLM Phoenix Metro.
Thank you for that. Can we move to the next slide? So this is just an outline of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to have about a 45-minute presentation, and then we're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A. So if any questions come up while we're going, please write them down, and we definitely want to get to them. We're going to have a breakout for 20 minutes to talk about how imperialism has affected your own life so we can really make it personal. And then we're going to close out talking about anti-imperialist solutions and our call to action. So to begin with, let's talk about anti-imperialism. So we know that over the summer, we saw last summer, when we talk about anti-imperialism, we often think it's this far away thing, right? We think about, it's in far off lands that the U.S. military is terrorizing. But no, it's here at home currently, because this summer we saw an unprecedented uprising with Black Lives Matter calling the end to state violence against Black bodies. And what was the U.S.'s response? More state violence. Not only did they bring out the police with military equipment, they brought out the actual military. And so while we know the military is an occupying force across the globe, we also saw it as an occupying force here in our own neighborhoods when we called out to stop killing us. And so what that shows is the state's response to people of color and all formerly colonized peoples' quest for liberation is to bring out the U.S. military. And we see this only on Black and brown folks, because on January 6th, we had real terrorists come and storm the Capitol. And what was their response? Well, those are white supremacists. Those are our pals. Those are our founding fathers. So what did they do? Absolutely nothing. And that's how they almost lost the Capitol, because of, the state only uses this military apparatus, on Black and brown folks. So when we come out and we say defund the police because they're killing us, we also need to talk about defunding the military because they're also killing us, not only here in the United States, but globally. Next slide. What we're fighting is a para-warfare. That means not quite the war, but the illusion of war, similar to the Cold War. They're using military tactics on us. And that's what they're doing here in the streets of Phoenix. As Black Lives Matter, we've been pounding the pavement at peaceful protests, and at some of these protests, they arrested us, and they, including myself, they tried to prosecute me and throw me away. But it's actually really incriminating to them. So this is some of the evidence they use to try to incarcerate me. And what we see here is a facial recognition form. Where is that coming from? ACTIC. What is ACTIC? ACTIC is Arizona's Counterterrorism Information Center. So that means that when Black people stand up and say, stop killing us, what do they say? That they say we're terrorists. And you see, when actual terrorists come, like all these mass shootings that happen every other week, the U.S. military and the counterterrorism isn't looking at them because they're too busy looking at us. And so this was actually an excerpt from police radios when they were talking to us as we were marching. And what are they doing? They're using military equipment. They had drones over us. They put cameras all around the entire city so that they could watch us. So when we say, even if we aren't thinking this is a war, they've made it a war by using this military equipment against us. And that's why when we think about where did they even get these military equipment? It comes from the surplus of the U.S. military. So even if we think that US imperialism isn't something that's directly impacting us. If you're out here in the summer, if you faced any of the impacts of the carceral state, then you also have been affected by US imperialism. Next slide. One back.
Okay, so when we think about everything that's gone down with the uprising and BLM protests, this might seem like it came out of nowhere, especially for people who don't really follow these events very well. And especially if this is your first time even getting involved with this topic. So I teach American literature. And one thing about American literature is that the longer you teach it and the more you dig deeper into it, the more it's very clear to understand that all of the events in American history are chain reactions. None of these events live in a vacuum. So we have to ask ourselves, how did we get here? Because the more I talk about protests, the more that the link seems to be increased response as far as policing and the militancy of the response. So there's a cycle to how we got here. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more generally first, and we're going to start applying it to not only America, but the whole world in a minute. But there's 4 stages. First is the trade stage, where there's a desire to leave, there's a desire to do more business, create better products, whatever. Then second comes the spread, where we see these nations, these imperialist empires, spreading out either colonially, economically, politically, socio-cultural, etc. So this is when imperialism really starts to show itself, and the definition for that is in the middle here. Imperialism is a regional or global system arising from colonialism and based on political, economic, and military control. So this is less about trade at this point and more about kind of cutting out the middleman and having more direct control of these things, especially from a business perspective. So then 3 is where we see change. The more control this imperialist nation has, the more they get to implement things from their culture, like money and financial institutions, government structure and practices, education systems, which I know a lot about, and language and religion. And then we get to this 4th stage, which we are currently in. This is the divide, rule, and control. So this is more about controlling that working class, because if you're there and you're extracting resources, who are the people doing that? People like you and me. And at some point, if we get fed up with that, and all of us get fed up with that, that's a problem. So this means controlling us through moral judgment, social and emotional limitations, policing, political and military propaganda, censorship, etc. And we keep each other in check. We're very complacent about this because we have our own differences, especially in a country like America. We can say, well, how does imperialism apply now? We're all a melting pot. We came here voluntarily. Y'all did. But first of all, we do things like divide in demographics, like regional differences. We live in the South, we live in the North, we live in the West Coast, and then they have their own economic differences in those regions. We also have differences in religion, ecological disparities, racial differences, and working class versus middle class, things that make us say things like, this isn't a race issue, this is a class issue, or you're not thinking about the gender perspective, intersectionalism that we don't tend to think about with each other. And then we wind up oppressing each other in addition to that. Next slide. So if we apply this a little bit more directly, Western imperialism is the thread that divides us, or that ties us actually. So as we know it, we call this new imperialism. And this is beginning in the 19th century, so this is 1800s. And this is characterized by European empires expanding specifically into Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the Americas. And this looks like things you might have learned about either in school or in movies, like the exploration of the Congo, Dutch colonies, Christian missionary pursuits in Africa and South America, the British colonial rule in India, the annexation of Hawaii. There's so many examples. So this leads to working populations relying on work in factories, the things that produce the goods we're looking for. They're extracting those resources, producing those goods, but it's mainly for that imperialist nation's consumption, not for them. And so imperialism works by gaining those resources and using it for industrialization. This allows for the sale of weapons, machinery, pesticides, etc. And as a result, we get to say, all right, we gave you the money to help you build these things in your country. You are now in debt to us. Oh, you can't pay back that debt because they're not getting any benefit from this. Well, we need to use more regulations with you. Your governments can now cut off social services. So if you take a look at this map here, there's a lot of color on that map. They're color coded for a reason. This is countries that have been under European control. There's a few discrepancies, and that's what my disclaimer says. Liberia and Ethiopia are technically not part of that. But overall, we see that European control is everywhere. So this is not a vacuum issue for each country. This is a global issue here. And over time, the consequences of imperialism lead to quite a few concerns. And these are things that we will address throughout this presentation, but we have human rights violations, rampant militarism and control, often disguised as democracy, and a depletion of resources and altering of ecosystems, which results in the need for global climate justice. So let's see what that looks like in the Americas first. Next slide.
Okay, so neocolonialism. So one thing we know is that imperialism and neocolonialism go hand in hand, right? So what is neocolonialism? It's also known as new colonialism. It is the act of using state-funded native government to indirectly control native people. This is done by giving some benefits of the dominant society to a small privileged minority in return for their help in assisting colonizer governments to secure resources for them and to ensure that the majority doesn't cause trouble. Now, neocolonialism also uses economic, political, cultural, or other pressures to control or influence other countries. An example could be all of the US-backed coups in Latin America that support right-wing candidates and in order to replace left-wing leaders. This is done to promote American business, aka the theft and extraction of resources and the exploitation of labor in another country for the benefit of America, right? For the benefit of Western countries. Another example of a neo-colonial tool is the International Monetary Fund, also known as the IMF. The IMF is an international bank that lends money to other countries. And the IMF lends money with, with many conditions. This is known as their structural adjustment programs. And the video that I'm going to show more talks about the IMF structural adjustment program and its effects in African countries. And if you hit next slide, it should automatically start the video.
Countries. The International Monetary Fund, a Bretton Woods institution, also known as the IMF, created a policy called structural adjustment loan policy. And these were basically loans with conditionalities, where in order to and many African countries received these loans, where in order to receive these loans, African countries had to cut back on their public service spending, such as education and health. And after decolonization, most African countries were either socialist or authoritarian, and they were doing pretty good as that. But structural adjustment made them radically privatize, radically capitalize their national economies. So what did this do? This left African countries in huge debt. This made African national economies devalue within the national system, a larger global system, and it also made their economies very weak within the larger global political economic system. The effects of structural adjustment is evident in the country of Zambia, one of the world's largest carpet producers. As the HDI statistics behind me suggest, because of structural adjustment, Zambia's infant mortality rate is extremely grotesque, where 1 in 5 Zambian children die by the age of 5. And also, as the life expectancy rate shows, life expectancy rate has decreased, and so has the primary school enrollment. Whereas Zambia's GDP rate has also been grotesquely low after the structural.
Okay. Yeah, so that video kind of talks more about how the IMF ends up actually hurting a lot of African and South American countries. And in the next slide, Raquel is going to talk more about neocolonialism and kind of how it manifests.
So if we look at this comparison here, at first it might seem wildly different, but there's actually a correlation. So we're going to talk about SARS in Nigeria and the connection that it has to the uprising and protest in the US. So first, what is SARS even? It's the Special Anti-Robbery Squad formed in 1992. And this has a complicated backstory, but the gist of it is that a military colonel was murdered by police. I believe this was a called to action, and soldiers were dispatched to take care of that. Unfortunately, this did lead to a strike in which many officers resigned. So there was this 2-week period where there were no police, or at least not enough police. And so there was a brief uprising in crime. And they felt something needed to be done about this, that there was no longer any watchers in the community. So they created their new task force, and that's SARS. So these people were a group of individuals. They weren't named the police. They weren't under a very structured unit, or at least not as structured as most police units. But despite that, they were still heavily armed. And they were also plainclothed for a while until later years. And even more problematically, some of them were those former police officers. So why exactly is that even a problem? This new unit was definitely not here to protect the community. And so a series of events would happen throughout the 90s and the 2000s that would create just this long, awful track record for them. And that includes things like manhandling suspects, creating unexplained and unrecorded deaths of suspects, accepting bribery, enacting several human rights violations, harassment and torture of innocent civilians, sometimes with no clear motive, even to the point of stopping people and accusing them of stealing the outfit they're wearing or the phone that they're holding, and just messing with the community. Next slide. So if we look at how this went down, there are a lot of parallels. But first, the saga did end by 2020 because of these protests that started in 2017. And they were meant to directly address the terrors of SARS in the community because it was just way out of control. And this was characterized by a decentralized movement, a nationwide response to the protest, an increase in direct action, massive media coverage and celebrity support, and escalated attacks on protesters ranging from, and this is from federal officers, being beaten to sprayed with tear gas and even shot to death. There were a few murders in these protests. So on October 4th, 2020, SARS operatives and other units were disbanded. But that's not completely done, because these people can still be displaced and redeployed anywhere else, which means there is the possibility that this could pop up again under another name. So if we look at what happened over the summer or over last summer with police brutality protests, there are parallels. And we see a rise in a decentralized movement, a nationwide highly popularized response to protest, an increase in direct action, massive media coverage, and escalated attacks on protesters from federal police and counter protesters, ranging from being shot with rubber bullets, tear gassed, kidnapped, and tracked. And so the fight for abolition in America is still ongoing. And it's receiving a lot of backlash. That's purposeful. So if we look at that imperialist cycle and compare it to this scenario, it's kind of obvious to see how we get here. And this is something that I noticed simply by just teaching American literature and by default, American history. So we have stage one, the first contact in Americas, this desire to expand. They realize this is something that can happen. Stage two, they spread out. They take over complete colonialism, slavery, the Trail of Tears, the mass genocide of Native Americans in general, and the establishment of the 13 colonies, which then transitions to stage three. Okay, well, we established ourselves here. We have to control the population that remains. So this is where we see things like the Jim Crow South, the rise in reservations, Indian schools, and police, and the rising sentiments of that, which started from the concept of a slave catcher. It just was called something different. And then lastly, we have that stage four, where we've been divided, and as a result, we are controlled. This is why we say things like, we live in a post-racial society. I have that in quotes because that's not real. Also, we have the rise in BLM protests as a counter to things like that. We've already divided each other by region, divided each other by morality and religion, by different cultures, by different race, by different economic situations. So we have fully followed this cycle, and it just keeps repeating itself. Okay, next slide.
So maybe you're wondering why Environmental Justice Coalition is focusing on imperialism. Well, the reason is similar to when Raquel was talking about the stages of imperialism. One of the main stages is theft. It's this extraction. And when, as climate justice activists, we know that fossil fuel and mineral extraction, resource extraction, is environmental degradation. So these things are all connected. When we look at, in climate justice, we always say the least responsible are most impacted, but do we talk about why? Oftentimes not. We need to talk about who the perpetrator is and who's causing this impact, right? And we see it here in this little, in both of these comics, we see who's causing the problem. It's the United States. It's the global north. They're taking up all of the ecological space. The photo below here of Africa is the continent of Africa. And then you have all of the Western and European oil companies stealing all of the wealth. And so even though colonialism technically is ended, we are, the global north is still stealing all of the resources from the global south. So nothing has changed. And that's why these countries are most impacted. How are they supposed to be able to do the leapfrog development, right? We want them to skip over fossil fuel development and jump into renewable and green development, which is what the United States isn't even doing, when all of their resources are being stolen by the United States and other Western countries. And so I want to give you a few examples of this theft that is happening now. This isn't some old colonial thing, even though it's been happening since colonialism. This is still happening. The Niger Delta in Africa. We see in Niger, they had a tremendous amount of oil. Shell came in, and Niger's military actually got contracted out. Shell borrowed their military to be able to defend the looting of their lands. And so Shell came in, stole all the oil, and then they also, during this process, had a bunch of oil spills because Black lives don't matter to them. And so they did their extraction. This often happens in the global south because their lives simply aren't valued at the same amount. So what happens? They actually ended up not, these spills destroyed their ecosystem. And so the Niger Delta community was a fisherman community. When the oil spilled all over the Delta, they no longer had fish to be able to, their economy was destroyed by Shell. And when they tried to defend themselves, they were killed by their own military, and they were called terrorists for trying to defend themselves. And now the community there is suffering from poverty. And then the Americans want to be, oh, look at those poor Africans, those starving Africans. No, you came in, you destroyed their ecosystem, you took their resources, and they are impoverished by intention. The U.S. intended to steal these resources. And we see it all over Africa and the global South. We see it in Congo. Most of our cell phones, and we're all guilty here, what's in this device that we have to buy now every about 2 years? Cobalt, lithium ion, these precious metals, the majority of these metals are found in Congo. And now Congo is being called one of the most dangerous places in the world. Why is that? Multinational corporations come in, they steal the resources, but in order to get away with stealing the resources, what do? They create conflict between the tribal communities. And oftentimes this conflict is basically the legacy of Western colonialism. And during colonialism, certain tribes were favored over other tribes. And then they prey upon that vulnerability that these colonizers put there in the first place, get the tribes to fight each other, and then they run off. In Congo, millions of dollars of resources are being stolen every single day to power our smartphones, while Congo remains one of the most dangerous places and one of the most impoverished places, despite the fact that they have some of the most resources. That is colonialism. That is current Western imperialism. And it's not just oil and other resources. It's also quinoa. In Bolivia, quinoa is the traditional food of the indigenous people in Bolivia. However, when white people decided quinoa was a superfood, they had a huge increase in the demand for quinoa. And I know that we on the other side here in the United States will remember when quinoa wasn't something that we always had. One day, quinoa was just everywhere, right? That huge uptick in demand rapidly displaced the indigenous people. The indigenous people in Bolivia can't even afford their indigenous food anymore because guess what? The Western countries decided they wanted it, and now the indigenous people don't have it anymore. And we could go on and on and on and on. This is just 3 examples, but we wanted to show you how prevalent this theft is, and that's what creates the climate vulnerabilities that these communities are suffering from now. Next slide. And all in all, this is rooted in the fact that America needs to mind their own business, okay? The problem here is that the U.S. has 800 military bases. There's only about 180 countries throughout the world, and they're focused only on mostly the Black and brown countries, the Middle Eastern countries. For example, we always hear about warmongering. Now, it's very important that when we listen to the U.S. media and the U.S. Military, when they say things like Iran wants war, how is Iran want war when, look at this, they don't want war. It's the U.S. that wants war. Look how many bases they put next to the country. And then they have the audacity to be like, oh, it's Iran that's trying to create a problem. Nah, it's you guys are coming in and you continue to poke people. And when they try to narrowly defend themselves or not be, impacted by this, imperialism, again, this is imperialism. Why is everyone concerned with Iran? Because of their natural resources, and because Iran wants to control their own resources, right? And it's important to notice, especially as young people, the U.S. has been at war with the Middle East since 2001. That's 20 years of war. That means to some people, your entire life has been under U.S. While the U.S. has been at war. And while we aren't very much impacted, we're not being bombed, we're doing the bombing. And that comes with, there's a certain amount of responsibility, those of us, even if we're immigrants, if we here live in the United States, we're benefiting from this U.S. imperialism. And so it's important to note that. And it's also important to look at the U.S. military is the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the entire world. And so the average US civilian uses 945 gallons. The only reason we have access to that much oil in the first place is because we sit here at the top of the empire. And where does this oil come from? It gets stolen. Currently, it's mostly being stolen out of the Middle East. And so, and which is why we've been at war with them for 20 years. And so even if, maybe you don't want to jump on defund the military, which is what needs to happen, because most of our dollars are going to protecting fossil fuel. We also look at the soldiers. Soldiers are being killed in large part defending fossil fuel. Is that worth people's lives over fossil fuel when we know fossil fuel is the same resource that's creating climate change? And yet we're over here sending our people to war to steal and imperialize other countries so that we can continue to burn the planet? None of this makes sense. So really, the US needs to stop being the global policeman, and they also need to stop, fighting these wars over oil. And it's up to us, those of us living in the belly of the beast, to put this pressure on ending these endless wars over fossil fuel. And it's also important to note here that when we look at US environmentalism, we never talk about the military. And yet we're never going to stop climate change without stopping the US military's endless consumption of oil. And so it comes down to a mindset. The US mindset is a colonizer mindset that continues to exploit and extract from nature. Next slide.
Okay, so yes, what Zara was saying. What is this mindset? Where is it coming from, right? So this is the dominant narrative around nature. This dominant narrative separates man from nature. It is the view that man is apart from nature versus man as a part of nature. And this dominant narrative, this is the Western perspective, right? This is what the global North. This is the global North mindset on nature. It views Mother Nature as having value because it has utility, because it can be used. Whereas the indigenous perspective believes man is a part of nature, and nature has intrinsic value. So Mother Nature has value simply because it exists. How do these play out? Well, we're seeing that the Western perspective on nature really informs capitalism. It says that things aren't useful to us unless we use them, which is where we see the commodification of our natural resources. This is where they're extracted with the use of exploited labor, right? They're sold for profit. And this results in environmental degradation, in pollution, displaced communities, hazardous living conditions, and not to mention human trafficking and sex trafficking, because of these extractive industries are so male dominated. But how differently can this play out? Well, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy has a law called the seventh generation principle, and this principle is what informs decisions made about natural resources. It says that decisions made must result in sustainable relationships with these resources for 7 generations. So this law ensures that people are in right relationship with nature for the long term, and ensures that future generations are being considered in current decisions. Meanwhile, in America, we're seeing that cities are barely adopting climate action plans, which is like 40 to 50 years after the science was realized, right? And with the Environmental Justice Coalition, we really operate from a decolonized perspective. So it is this decolonized perspective that really informs our work. So we do more closely align with an indigenous perspective on environmental justice issues. Next slide.
All right, so yet another facet of imperialism, and a lot of what my comrades have discussed really are what's the consequences of those things, and migration is one of them. And so border imperialism, what is border imperialism? Border imperialism depicts the processes by which the violence and precarities of displacement and migration are structurally created as well as maintained. And all of what we've been talking about thus far, are the violences and precarities that are structurally created, right? And so the key word in this is structure. Border imperialism did not happen by accident. It was designed as a system to oppress and impoverish colonized people. And the author of Undoing Border Imperialism, Harsha Wali, describes it as the lens focusing on structures of global displacement and migration and inclusion, and in collusion with capitalism, colonial empire, and state building. And so some examples of the structures, right? Again, displacement. People are being displaced because of imperialism, because of funded wars in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, economic neoliberalism, transnational capitalism, exploitation of wealth, exploitation, extraction industry. This all causes unbalance, particularly in the global South. And it forces people into migration, and also climate change, right? The climate crisis is a root cause of migration. And with that displacement, people are simultaneously met with the militarization of the border. So as an example, in Arizona, on the Tohono O'odham Nation, they're using the same technology there as they're using in Palestine, right? And so this migration and border imperialism is an indigenous struggle. So we have to stand in solidarity with indigenous people. An example of how these two coincide is in 1994, NAFTA was implemented in the US, and NAFTA was it is extremely devastating to people, particularly corn farmers in Mexico. And so that caused people to be displaced. And the same year, Operation Gatekeeper was implemented by the colonial government. So you have the colonial government displacing people and using militarization of the border in the same year. And that didn't happen by coincidence, right? Like, they planned this shit out. Excuse my language. I don't know if this is PG-13. Anyways, the next example is criminalization, right? So, this is a part of the detention centers are a part of the prison industrial complex. And so in the US, undocumented migrants are the fastest growing population, prison population. The next one is the racial hierarchy. And so this is the understanding and shaping of, quote unquote, citizenship and belonging within a nation state. And this is caused with global white supremacy and the racialization of othering people, right? And so again, Arizona is fantastic for examples. SB 1070 was a prime example of how the state violence was allowed to racially profile people and asking them, and wherever they were, right? They give them the opportunity to ask them if they were, quote unquote, legal. And the next one is the exploitation of labor of migrants, right? So for the capitalist interest. And so the state apparatus has legalized and premeditated the exploitation of migrants. And again, this exploitation is accompanied with disenfranchisement in the labor force. We can pass to the next slide.
Okay. So, yes. So climate crisis, migration, and refugees. So we're seeing, well, by now we know that neocolonialism is used to advance imperialism. And we know that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. And we know that it is these systems that are carried out by colonizer governments, colonial governments, that have caused climate change. So who is being affected by climate change? Zara mentioned earlier that it is usually the least responsible that are the most impacted. So that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing islander communities and coastal communities that are feeling the effects first. We're seeing fishing and farming communities that are being affected by drought, desertification, changing temperatures, etc. For example, the Niger Delta example that Zara gave earlier, of the fishing communities who lost their means of living because Shell came in and polluted their waters. We're seeing low-income communities being affected by climate change, right? Because they have less resources to be able to migrate. So along with that, migration is not just a Latinx issue. We've been seeing migration from Africa, from islander communities. It's important to know that migration isn't just a Latinx issue, because then we fail to see how Black, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and our Indigenous brothers and sisters are experiencing displacement and migration. Additionally, in the context of the American immigration enforcement system, we're seeing that Black migrants are overrepresented in deportation proceedings. So while Black migrants make up 5.4% of the undocumented population, they made up 10.6% of all deportation proceedings from 2003 to 2015. And how is the state responding to climate refugees? Well, we know that the state is going to continue to criminalize anyone who isn't white and who's trying to seek refuge. We know that the state already over-criminalized our Black community, and hence their overrepresentation in deportation proceedings. We know that the state is going to respond with more funding for the Department of Homeland Security, so more funding for Customs Border Patrol and more funding for immigration enforcement, immigration customs enforcement. And we're going to keep hearing violent stories about what's happening in detention centers. These things are already happening. They've been happening, right? We've been having climate refugees. The past couple of caravans that have been coming in from Central America are climate refugees. So we're going to continue to keep having migrants coming in. And that's why we need to anticipate this, and we need to work at abolishing prisons. We need to abolish detention centers. We need to abolish the military, because these are things that are happening and that we're seeing, especially in Arizona, especially in places that border Mexico, where we're seeing a lot of criminalization, a lot of unnecessary deaths happening at the border. Next slide.
And so we want to leave you with a note about international solidarity, and even more so, we want to change the language that we're talking about this solidarity, because international solidarity is still focusing on the nation state. And the nation state has never been for Black and brown folks. Nation states were created during colonialism and imperialism, and most of these border walls were created by colonizers, and they mean nothing to us. So we invite you to move past international solidarity and to solidarity from a lens of revolutionary intercommunalism. Well, what does that mean? To start with, revolutionary intercommunalism was a term created by the Black Panther Party chair, Huey Newton. And Huey Newton was a great scholar. He was had his JD and was working on his PhD, but of course, you know, him being a Black revolutionary was never recognized by the institutions, despite the fact that he was one of the first scholars that talked about globalization. Huey Newton realized that the Black Panther Party at the time were Black nationalists. And yet he looked at the fact that, and so that means that they were about, Black folks within the United States creating their own nation, but it is still tied to the idea of nation state, right? And then they were like, well, it's not just Black people in America. Let's be Black internationalists. Let's build with all Black people. But then he realized that there was nothing in the nation state for us. Nation states have never been about us. Even in Africa, nation states are often colonial vestiges, right? And so really, it's about building with communities across the world, regardless of the nation state. And so that's what the Panthers did. They were revolutionary intercommunalists. And so that's why they had bases in Tunisia and Libya and Cuba and many other countries in the global South. And it wasn't bases, it wasn't set up, by these nation states. They just had these compounds that they could go to that were built by other Black people around the world. And so that's what we want to suggest today. We look at multinational corporations. They have long since superseded the nation, right? That is what a multinational corporation is. They have no solidarity to any one nation. They only have solidarity to themselves. And that's reactionary intercommunalism. What we're calling for is a revolutionary intercommunalism. Let's build with Black and brown folks across the world. Let's not focus on whatever nation state we are in, especially us being in the belly of the beast. We should not be loyal to this imperial nation, but to our communities who are being harmed by this imperial nation. And so what does that look like? It means building an international lens or an intercommunal lens. And so we see this currently in the movement. It does lack an internationalist lens. For example, oftentimes there was a fight around taking a knee. And they said taking a knee was they were like, well, if we take a knee, you see, you're disrespecting the military. And there was a clarification. We're just talking about police, not the military. But why not? Why aren't you talking about the military when the US military is the largest killer of Black people globally, right? We need to look outside of just the United States. We need to make sure that our focus, when we look at things, we're not being NIMBYs, not in my backyard. NIMBYs also can be on a nation state. Are we making sure solutions that we chose when we fight for climate justice don't harm other people in other countries? Everything from electronics recycling, where are those electronics going to climate policies like cap and trade, which hurt communities of color in the global South. And so that's what we want y'all to end on, is just making sure that we build with a revolutionary intercommunal lens. Let's make sure that we have solidarity with all colonized people. And now we want to open it up for questions. Thank you guys all for listening. So you guys can go off mute, or you can type in the chat for this questions now.
Hi, I'm Megan. I was curious how you guys think the seventh generation policy or mindset can play into climate policy nowadays, and how we can get, politicians, which is hard because they're in control of things, although obviously they don't share a lot of the same ideals that we need to move forward, how we can kind of get them on board with a more forward-thinking mindset that's not damaging to the global South in the way that we have been historically with climate policy. It's a very broad question, so.
That's a really good question. And I'm gonna let my comrades also please like pitch in. The immediate thing that I think about is how these colonial governments, they don't really serve us, right? Like they function in a way where they are just directly responding to what is directly in front of them. And I fail to see how um, we could make that switch, just because the legacies of these governments very much have been to support you know, just capitalism in general. I don't know, like Zara, Jess, Raquel, if y'all have any thoughts on this. I tend to be a bit pessimistic.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, getting the imperialist colonial state to think indigenously would kind of require it to abolish itself, if we're getting specific here. However, how can we look at this as a lens of harm reduction, right? I think one thing is most policies are only looking at, if we're being honest, usually political terms are 2 to 4 years. Usually that's the lens of a policy because, they only really care about themselves. Sometimes with climate policies, we can get them to think 10 years ahead, right? But 7 generations, is really asking them to look at what are the impacts 70 years from now, right? And so having them look out way past their own lifespan, right? Because most of these are old white men that aren't going to be around for longer than 10 or 20 years. And so they're not really looking at even 10 to 20 years, let alone 70. And so I think one way we can do this is look at the impacts of a policy 70 years out. And that allows them to have this long-term thinking. And that also is something, policymakers, they have a lot of data analysis, legislative aides, and other people who can do the research to really look at what the impact is decades out instead of just 4 years out.
Thank you.
We also got some more questions in the chat. Let me read them out loud. Okay, so Mary Liz Estrella asks, how can we get the climate movement to focus on anti-war efforts since it significantly contributes to the climate crisis? So this is something that we've been talking about in our coalition. This is something we want to kind of see, we want to start pivoting towards, is really finding ways to like subtly slip in military abolition. And, I think, Zara, you have more points on this that I would want you to share.
Yeah, so we're going to get into some of the solutions here, but I think it's really about, we really need to move the mainstream environmental groups to even name the military. And I've talked to local Sierra Club chapters before and tried to get them to talk about the military, and they're like, we just want to conserve land, like that's too political. But the reality is climate and the environment has always been political, right? Because what we're fighting, similar to what Colin was talking about earlier, what we're fighting here is actually a fight against worldviews. Right now, the US is operating in a colonial worldview, which sees nature as a resource to extract. So we need to move past that. We need to move to look at nature as a part of nature. And if we look at us as a part of nature, then we could never allow what the U.S. military is doing. And so once we start to move past this colonial framework, then we see how, because usually the way that conservation done is from a colonial framework. It's, oh, we own nature, so we have to take care of it. And that's not true. That's not even a good way to do conservation work, because we never owned nature, and so we need to move past that and really look at, if the reality is, if we do not focus on the US military, we will not address the issues. And so even there's been larger groups, for example, the Union of Concerned Scientists started a team, and the Union of Concerned Scientists, they never were anti-imperialists. They actually were trying to be pro-military, using pro-military arguments, saying it's a security risk to use this much military and we need to diversify our economy. They have the oil, and they have a goal to cut U.S. military oil in half. And so there are different ways that we can look at that, but ultimately it's also a perspective change and moving from this colonial dominion. I also want to say, someone asked, I don't know where it is, someone asked for short readings. I'm going to drop some in the chat right now, which might be helpful.
So I think there was another question in the chat. What are some ways that we can adopt revolutionary intercommunalism when it comes to lithium extraction for renewables? How can we prevent corporations from co-opting movements with green capitalism? I think I'm going to take a stab at the first part of this question. And I would say that a part of international intercommunalism is, like the global north, recognizing that we live in a culture of consumption, of constantly consuming. And so in our efforts to decrease our consumption, we're not going to need as much resource to produce renewable energies, right? Decreasing our need for energy will ultimately decrease our need to extract.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think that one of the issues with green capitalism is that what it does is create a whole nother chain of production. So now you have an option of a green option, but you still have the non-green options, right? So instead of having 4 products, which each have their own chains of production, we have 5 products, which include the green version, right? And so what we're doing is actually creating more consumption. So at the heart of it is we actually need to reduce consumption. That is really at the heart of many of this. And because of the capitalist empires like the United States, they get to control things. So even when you look at, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, right? There's 17 Sustainable Development Goals the United Nations made. One of them is responsible consumption. Well, initially it was actually reduced consumption, but the United States said, hey, we don't want reduced consumption because, our economy is based on consumption. So why don't we make it responsible consumption? And that's where you get the green capitalism and another option, but it's still all the other options. And in the end, you're creating more consumption. So what we need is, I think one of the big things, and again, this can be co-opted too, right? But one of the big things is closed loop systems. And so, essentially we need to, right now, we're not recycling lithium ion, but there's a way that can be done, but it's expensive. So they export it to other countries and they sometimes do it, but the ways that they're doing it causes a lot of harm to the people doing it because they don't have the resources to do it. So we really need to push for a recycling of cell phones, ensuring that it's done domestically. Let's not make this someone else's problem when we are the largest consumer of phones. So if we're going to get a new phone every 2 years, we need to make sure every single piece of that phone can be used again. And that's a closed loop system. So linear economies, which is what we have, you extract the resource, you build it in a factory, you export it out, we buy it, we consume it, and we throw it away. That's a linear, but we live on a finite planet. So everything needs to be put back into the system that it was created from, so that there is no waste, so that there is no landfills, so that everything can be used again. And that's one way when we look at the extraction of lithium ion that we're not doing, and one way we can change that. Now, how can this be co-opted? We see right now, Nike recently created a shoe line of a closed loop shoe line. So you can recycle shoes through Nike and they'll make a new shoe. But again, that's the green capitalism, because guess what? Only one of their shoes is remade. And that's just creating another line of production. And so it's really important that as we move to closed loop systems, we make that the only option. I also see a comment in here about how the military recruits mostly from Black, brown, and cash poor communities, which is really an important note, right? They're preying upon the most vulnerable people who have no other option. And that's who they send to the front lines to this war. And so, it's that point right there. One, we also need to be recruiting. We also need to be educating. And this, isn't something for white people to do. Let's just be honest. But, educating our Black and brown communities about the dangers of U.S. imperialism and how, you don't want to just be another trooper, holding the flag and the impacts of that. It's also important, as we are anti-imperialists, that we realize that most of the soldiers are folks that have no other option. So it's important not to blame soldiers and not to become, I don't support the troops. I feel bad for them. But I'm never going to shame an individual soldier for fighting in the military, right? Because then you start to become classist, because it's oftentimes not their choice. And so realizing it's a system here and not blaming individuals is also important.
Now we have the final 10 minutes to talk about just calls to action. And Zara, lead the way.
Cool, thank you. Could we get slide number 18? Really, I can just talk about it if it's easy.
Got it.
Okay. So, what do anti-imperialist solutions look like? Now, solutions is a problematic word. Let me first and foremost say that. Because, many of these things are systemic. They're not going to be solved overnight. But how do we take an action-oriented lens to these problems, right? How do we address these problems with an anti-imperialist lens? Now, one of the first things that needs to happen is the United Nations currently does not recognize climate refugees. That means if you are being displaced because the rising tides, because, famine or any of these things, they don't recognize you as a refugee, right? So that means you have to leave undocumented and having no political support. And so right there, it's one example of the fact that, for example, with my father, who was a climate refugee from Ethiopia, he was not able to leave when the famine happened. He had to wait until it turned into a war and they were killing, young Black boys. And that's when he got to leave, because now there's a whole war and now they recognize you as a refugee. The same thing happened in Syria. So it's really important that we don't wait until it turns into all-out war and people are dying to let people leave their countries. If your food, if your water, if your land is being submerged by the ocean, you are a refugee. And the United Nations needs to recognize this, because, by 2050, there's going to be an estimated 200 million refugees from the climate, and they're not going to be recognized. That means they're just going to be continue to be killed and not allowed to leave legally, right? And so if they leave illegally, then they have all of these other challenges. That's one way that we can really begin to address the climate refugee crisis, because similar to what Karen was talking about earlier, we see the US's response to climate refugees has been to build a wall. So, the US does have a climate policy. It's building an armored lifeboat so that they can kill off the starving refugees as they come to our door. So it's really important that we create a climate refugee distinguished, because that's not only the US. All over Europe, we see this as increasing African refugees come to Europe looking for a place to be because their resources were destroyed by these European countries. They're saying no. So that's one way we can address the migration that is bound to happen because of climate change. Another thing is defunding the police and the military. We know across the United States, the majority of city budgets go to the police, right? That's a problem, right? And then we look at the majority of our federal budget goes to the military. That's a problem. We need to stop weaponizing countries, especially when we have this impending climate crisis that is not only going to happen, it is happening, right? So and you know what when we tell our government we need to address climate change, what do they say? We don't have funding for it. We can't afford a just transition. Why can't you afford a just transition? Because you're spending all your money on guns and bullets, on the military. And so when we talk about a just transition, when we talk about things like a Green New Deal, how are we going to fund the Green New Deal? Yes, we should have the 1% funded, but especially as communities fight for a Green New Deal locally in their cities, we can fund it by taking money from the police and the military. There's plenty of funding there. And when we fight for a Green New Deal, it's really important that it is one that is centered around climate justice and climate equity. We need to ensure that the communities who've been most impacted by US imperialism, US colonialism, and now climate change are the ones centered in this Green New Deal. So let's take money from that which is harming us and let's put it into that which will protect us in the future from climate change.
Snaps. Thanks, Zara. Okay, well, so then next, we have 5 minutes left. So with that, we really just want to put a quick plug. So if you want to stay updated with us, or up to date with us, follow us on Instagram, right? We're on Instagram as the Phoenix Environmental Justice Coalition, I think. And then I'm on Simi as AZ, which is a migrant rights organization, Tempe based. Follow them. They're also doing a Decarcerate AZ campaign focused on decarcerating the state. So if I have any AZ folks, be connected with them. And then of course, follow BLM Phoenix Metro on IG to see just the things that they're doing. And that's all we have for you all. We have 3 minutes. We can go around and just maybe if folks want to share any brief insights, a couple words, something short and simple, what you learned, what you took away, or how you're feeling.
I'm feeling very thankful for you guys and everything that you've provided for us today. And also naturally feeling very angry. And yeah, definitely need to go out and do something because I might explode if not.
Yeah, I really want to encourage folks to just plug into their local grassroots movements that are calling for abolition. They're doing work around defunding the police and the military.
Anybody else? If you guys can put like one word how you're feeling in the chat too, or you could unmute. So if that's everyone, I just want y'all to know, thank you for listening. Please try to apply this to whatever climate work you're doing. Let's look at this from a revolutionary intercommunal lens. Let's not have any solidarity with nation states, but with communities, all colonized communities globally. And let's look at if you're working on a Green New Deal, if you're fighting for a just transition and your government is telling you they don't have money from it, now you know where the money's at. Let's take the money from the police, let's take the money from the military, and let's fund a just transition.